There we go. Welcome again, everyone, to Using Digital Mapping Activities to Develop Critical Thinking. We are so excited tonight to have Dr. Aaron Willis, our Chief Learning Officer for Social Studies Services. He spent over 2 decades working with social studies, and on the side, he even does a little bit of bird watching. He is very concerned and interested in helping teachers become better. So I always learn a lot from him. I'm really excited tonight to see what he has to share. We will be using the chat feature on the right-hand side at the bottom and use that for any communication. I'll be monitoring that and let Aaron know if there's some questions and things. Also, there'll be a survey at the end, so please participate in that when we close the session today. So without waiting any longer, let's get to Dr. Aaron Willis. Who is self-muted right now. Aaron,
I
you're
was, yeah,
there.
I
We
was self-muted. I'm not used to doing that to myself. I should probably do it to myself more often, but that's another story. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm excited to go through this with you today. This is a little bit of a preview of a session that we're going to be offering at the National Council for the Social Studies later this month, later this week even. And it's allowed me to think through some new ideas in terms of how to use some of the ideas from C3 to use geography as a disciplinary lens to help students understand more about world history. So that's the big frame for today's activity. I'm going to be talking about I'm going to use a specific example when I get to the mapping, and but it's really meant to be the general ideas that I'm talking about here. So we'll come back to that at the end and make sure to make that obvious as well. So the place where I'm beginning is with the C3 framework. The C3 framework is driving a lot of the lessons and curriculum development, as well as the development of state standards across the country. And this framework, we've done a number of other webinars on this, but essentially 4 elements that are part of what we call largely the inquiry arc. And that the 4 dimensions, one is you begin with formulating good questions. Then students move on to using disciplinary, I'm pointing here to the little light bulb here, using disciplinary lenses in order to analyze the topics before them. And that could be geography or history or economics or civics. Those are the 4 main lenses. And then looking at sources and how we're using sources as a way to validate the evidence that we're collecting, understanding what kind of evidence we might want to collect, and whether there's point of view behind that evidence or bias or different contexts that might change our interpretation. And then finally, the 4th dimension of the C3 is communicating results and taking informed action. And here the vision is really that any project that the students undertake, any learning that they undertake, should be demonstratable in a way that they're able to communicate that to others, that should be one of the goals of a good lesson, is that students have some sort of work product which demonstrates their knowledge. And thinking creatively about how students can communicate those results really gives us a lot of freedom and flexibility and wonderful tools to engage student learning. So the fact that they're going to be doing something and communicating to their peers or taking action based on what they've learned really gives a direction to what they're learning. So that's why I begin with the C3 framework. I think it really can guide our thinking. Now, personally, I've got a 4-step process that I'm going to be featuring today, and this I call Read, Question, Map, Connect. And this is going to be our ideas for connecting geographic literacy to essential questions, to the C3 framework, and ultimately to trying to help students make connections between what they're studying in the past and making that meaningful for them today in the present. So we're going to look at this 4-step process in terms of how it can give us a structure for implementing a lesson which involves literacy skills, developing good questions, as well as students creating their own maps and then understanding how those maps of the past might reflect on things in today's world. So I'm going to use an example from our unit on African empires. All the examples I'm going to pull today are taken either from our Mapping World History program published by Nystrom Education, or the Atlas of World History, also a new edition, copyright 2020 from Nystrom Education. But anything that I'm talking about here today, you can find maps for students to make freely on the web. You can use any atlas, so a history atlas that you want, or even like look up history maps online and use them. There's lots of resources out there for you to be able to do this, even if you don't have access to the Nystrom mapping programs. But I did want to use these programs because they're colorful and they're helpful, and I'm pulling this from a program called Mapping World History. It's a unit on African empires. There's 3 core readings to it: the Bantu migrations, the travels of Ibn Battuta, and we're going to focus today on the empires of West Africa. So how can we implement our read, question, map, connect strategy with the focus on the empires of West Africa? Well, let's go in and take a look. So the first place I'm going to begin is with a reading, and I've excerpted this short reading from our program called Mapping World History, and we have just a very brief reading there. You can find anything, but here I've managed to get, like in 2 paragraphs, something basic that gives us an idea of what was going on at the time. And let me just indulge myself here and read it to you. Normally I'd hand this out and ask the students to read it on their own. But let's do this for the sake of the webinar. With the fall of ancient Egypt and Kush came the rise of other African cultures and civilizations. The first were the Bantu and the Aksum, cultures indigenous to Africa. The Bantu people began immigrating from Western Africa in 500 BCE, and they spread south and east. They brought their innovative farming practices and metalworking skills. The Aksum Empire defeated the Kush, eventually controlling the Red Sea. Through the ivory and incense trade, Aksum came to control much of East Africa and the Mediterranean, spreading Christianity through these regions. When the Aksum fell, these areas were conquered by the Islamic empires, which came to control much of North Africa. Increased trade and later the Crusades brought increased contact between Islamic and non-Islamic people and expanded knowledge and learning. In Western Africa, Ghana, and later Mali and Songhai grew wealthy on the gold trade and came to control the southern trade routes. As in the north, trade centers like Jani and Timbuktu became important centers for learning. At the same time, Swahili culture, a mix of Islamic, African, and Asian cultures, was developing in East Africa. Cities in this region, like Great Zimbabwe, grew more populous and wealthy because of the salt, ivory, and gold trade with Western Africa and Asia. So we've got here is a very small chunk of text, but it should be enough to get our students thinking about questions. And I want to talk about 2 types of questions here, what we call essential questions and supporting questions. And these are detailed a little bit in the C3 framework, but I think that we can pick it up and use it in our own ways. So essential questions are going to be timeless questions, questions that may have no answer, like why do countries even trade at all? Or how can certain things have a value like salt or gold? Where does that come from? No clear right or wrong answers, and the questions can apply just about to any period in human history. It's these essential questions which are important to bring out for the students because they're going to help us to connect what's happening in the past to issues today, and that's hopefully going to make something more relevant to them. Now, supporting questions are going to be more context-based, so they're going to be more about something maybe specifically that's happening in West Africa. In the context of this reading, maybe why was trade so important in this region? Or how did these countries get wealthy by trading salt and gold? Something specific to the area. Now, I've got a couple of both essential and supporting questions that I generated from the reading here. Let's go back to the reading. And everybody try and think of one big essential question that you would pull out of this. Remember, it's something that would apply to any time period, and maybe one specific supporting question that you would pull out of this. I'll give you a second to think about it. Okay, so here's some of the essential questions that I came up with. Why do people trade? What is the relationship between trade and religion? How does the spread of ideas influence trade? Does trade lead to greater or fewer choices for consumers? What inhibits trade? And why are some items perceived as valuable? These are all questions that a student could have generated based on that reading. Okay, these are the big questions. And I want to focus on students generating their own questions. So part of this question strategy, we give them a reading, but we want to use that as a prompt really to get them to develop as many questions as possible. And the strategy that I use here is really just to get them to maybe they work in a group and they generate as many questions as they can think of. The more, the better. And then they highlight maybe what they think their best questions are and share those with the rest of the class. The nice thing about this is it engages the students, it gets them thinking and wondering about what's there. And then as they go through the lesson, they're in effect answering some of the same questions that they generated. Now, the same applies for supporting questions, and this just gives us an opportunity for the students to focus in. Here, supporting questions are context-bound. They take up a particular time in space, and so here, how did African kingdoms become wealthy? What items were traded in West Africa, and how were they transported? And what were the effects of greater wealth in the African kingdoms? Okay, we saw something, I think there was a mention of great centers of learning like Timbuktu. So we know that there's things that are coming out of that. So that's the second part of this 4-part system. We have a reading, and then we move to students developing their own questions, both essential questions and supporting questions, as many as they can generate. Then we share that together as a class, and that sets us up so that we're ready to begin mapping. Now, in this case, in order to create the maps that I want the students to create, we're going to use an atlas of world history that has a number of pages in it that are going to tell us, sort of take us through and allow us to understand where things were. And then the students are going to use these maps in their atlas as a way to create their own maps. And of course, you've got some cool things here like, you know, why salt? That's an interesting thing. And the value of salt and the fact that salt was traded in West Africa and made people fabulously wealthy is really counterintuitive and worth getting the students to think about a little bit. So we've got these pages that we might use, and then we get to the students actually creating a map. Now, this is a map that I threw together using our new digital mapping program, Mapping World History by Nystrom Education. It's part of the Nystrom World Package. And I use this, a digital interface to be able to, I went through a set of instructions. Actually, let me show you what that looks like. Let me switch over to that here. You're seeing my screen now. I'll go to full screen here. Here's what the mapping interface looks like. I've got instructions up here on the right-hand side. I've got my map over here on the left, which I can manipulate and move around. I've got tools here like little stamps, and I'm going to follow these instructions here. And it says to place a camel stamp near the Atlas Mountains. So I'm going to place a camel stamp here and then close that out. I'm going to go along in my instructions, and it says to use a pencil tool, draw an arrow from the camel to the label for West Africa. I did that just before we got in here. So I've got my tool here, and I'll draw a line here from there to West Africa, and there's my line. Close that out. Let's see what my next instructions are. To place a gold stamp in present-day Senegal, I'll grab my little stamp here, put the gold stamp here, and oh, I better find Senegal on here. And oh, here it is over here. So now I get my stamp, grab my gold, place it there, close that out, go to the next name. A salt in the Sahara. So this is giving me a chance as a student to be able to go through and understand where these things were and to place them, and then to establish the relationships from them. So I'm going to close this out now. I need to put a coin up here near Rome. So I get my stamp, go to my coin, put the coin up in here in Rome. What's next? I'm going to look at this Empire of Ghana map. That was on my atlas, but we'll take it for a shortcut. We're going to mark Timbuktu down here as a capital. And here's my capital sign. And we begin then also to create connections and show that you can go between that gold was traded and went here to Rome. And we begin to make that map. So that's a little bit of the digital tool that I use to get to this. Let's go back to this as it was more completed. And so here, after a few more minutes on the map, I've created something like this. So the students can do this. You can find a blank outline map on the web. You can use one of the mapping programs from Nystrom, wherever you really get the map. The idea is to be able to have the students understand and go through a series of steps in order to map out a time in history so that they can understand the relations, where things were moving from and to, what was coming, where was gold, where were coins, where was salt, who was trading what, how, where, and when. And through this process, they're really creating deeper neural networks, more connections to how they can remember this. And then the last section was called Connect. So we had read, and then question, then map, and now connect. And so here what I was able to pull in the Atlas of World History, we have a section here on historical issues today. In this case, does trade strengthen nations? So we're going back, that's one of the essential questions that we could have pulled out of the previous our work on questioning, though nations are a modern concept, so it would have probably looked a little bit different, more like the why do people trade, but here's a variation on that. And so here's a way for us to take something that we're learning about 15th century Africa, and we're understanding what's happening there, what people are trading, and now we're able to make a connection to present day. And in this case, we're going to see we've got an overview, we've got a map here, we've got different types of pie charts, and then we've got sort of pros and cons. Global trade benefits the people in all nations, or global trade benefits certain groups living in developed countries at the expense of those living in developing nations. And if you go through, you can create an activity where students maybe do a debate based on the pros and cons of these things. And in the mapping program, we do have these types of handouts that you can use. But really, for anything that you're doing, any period that you're teaching, you can probably find a contemporary issue and find some pro and con articles online and give those to the students. So once again, I'm illustrating the larger point of trying to find something that allows students to connect what they're learning in the past to the present day. So we're developing there, and here's where we can really develop the critical thinking skills. They've got sort of a pro and con approach here, and we're going to ask them to dig in on that and to imagine, and I think in this case the activity calls for creating a debate, pro and con, and that students should work in small groups to establish the questions that are going to be relevant for them to make sense of the world. So just to reiterate, we're talking about this four-step process. We find a short passage for the students to read, and emphasizing short. We don't want them to be overwhelmed by the reading. We just want to use it as a prompt to get them thinking about the time and the place. So you really, this could be something you pull out of a textbook. It could be something you pull out of a supplemental. It could be something you pull out of the web. But I would recommend keeping it to sort of a maximum of 2 paragraphs. Our main goal here is to, of course, to provide a little bit of background information, but really more to prompt the students to think about both the essential and supporting questions that are behind that. And once again, this idea of the students developing their questions gets them to buy into what they're learning about, gets them to learn based on their own questions that they generated as you go through a unit. Then we add in the mapping element, and the map allows them to understand the relationship between the different regions and places that they're studying, what might be traded in this case, where and when and by whom. If it's other types of issues, if you're doing sort of a mapping of the Black Plague, you would show the plague coming from Central Asia and being transferred by boats into port cities, you could clearly map something very interesting there. And so there's many different periods in world history that are very ripe for the students creating their own maps, and through the creation of their own maps, not just looking at a map in a textbook, but actually creating the map themselves. It brings them into that process and engages them in a way that creates visual connections for them, and really more opportunities for them to make those connections in their brain that are going to help them retain that information when it comes time to an assessment, and also once again developing those skills that they're going to need to be successful as 21st century citizens. Moreover, the idea of creating the map really lends itself to that idea of students creating work, that fourth dimension of being able to communicate conclusions. And in a map, the students are able to communicate something that they're presenting to you in terms of, well, this is what happened in this period, and I'm using it to explain it to you. So you could have the students sort of give a narrative history of the map. The connect element, where we connected it to today, that also gives the students an option to really see how things connect to today, to communicate that, and potentially to take a stand or informed action on that particular issue. So really excited about this as a four-step process. I've just written a blog about this, and I'm going to copy and paste this into the chat area, so you guys can just click on it and go directly to the blog. The blog describes these 4 steps. It uses the West African lesson, and if you go to that blog and then click on the free lesson link at the bottom of that web page, it'll give you all the resources that we just used for this lesson on mapping the African kingdoms, and for the students' understanding about the trade routes as well as the contemporary trade issues. So let me pop out here and put this into our chat area. And let's see, I need to do this. Is going to go to everybody. Okay, and that just pasted in there. It looks like it might be really big, but you should be able to click on it. Okay, it looks like maybe it put it twice, but you can click on that. That'll take you to the web page with the blog article. It describes this 4-step process as well, and allows you to get a sense of the free lesson there. With that said, that pretty much summarizes our approach today, and I'd be happy to open it up to questions. You can type your questions into the chat area, and I'm happy to respond.
That was wonderful, Aaron. While we're waiting on any questions or responses, you hit all the things that I was writing down. Meaningful connections for students and students doing the work. Those were my 2 main ones. I love that aspect.
Yeah, it's really the focus here is how can we get the students really to be more engaged and take more responsibility for their own learning. So the idea that the reading isn't overwhelming, but it gives them something to sort of help them develop their own questions. And of course, we need to be there to facilitate them, to help them understand the essential questions and the supporting questions. We need to give them examples. But if we do this over periods of time, and this doesn't, of course, need to be limited to world history. This is equally applicable to U.S. history or any topic that you're studying. The same 4-step process can really apply and can engage the students.
Yes, I agree. Wonderful.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat area, but I'm happy to stay here for as long as anybody might think of anything. Hopefully they're clicking on the link and going out to the blog to get access to the lesson that we just discussed.
Yes. There's several other articles on the blog that Aaron has written also that I was looking at, in fact, today. So you can check those out also. Sometimes I know it takes a while to type, And sometimes people move on too fast while I'm still typing, so I completely understand that. But if anyone does have any questions, make sure you put them down there and we'll make sure that we get to everyone. You can also use Erin's email address, erin@socialstudies.com. If you find any questions later or are confused about a part, maybe while you're working through it, feel free to.
Well, I saw what Tina just posted here. Tina, thanks for that. I'm really glad that you were able to see how we're, sort of leveraging what was created by the very intelligent teams at Nystrom, and how we're trying to think of new ways to give this life and to integrate it into a meaningful way for student experiences that will continue to help them make meaningful connections to history and to the world around them. Awesome. Thanks for coming out.
I agree with Tina. Have fun at NCSS.
Great. Okay, well, I think we've got a successful session for the day. And if any of you do have questions or would like to follow up, please check in. You've got my email address here on the screen, erin@socialstudies.com. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Follow me on Twitter at Dr. Erin Willis. We'll be posting when we do create new lessons like this. It's a great way to find out what's going on and what's new.
Wonderful. Thank you everybody again for coming, and have a fabulous night.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for hosting.
Thank you. Good night.